Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Celia Brigg. I'm the Assistant Director for Conferences and Events at Advance HE, and I would just like to welcome you to our first virtual teaching and learning conference. I just want to do a bit of housekeeping before we start properly this morning. So, as delegates attending this keynote session, your videos and mics will automatically be turned off. So please use the chat function if you would like to talk to us, to ask a question, or if you have any queries. For any technical issues, if you look on the participants list on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see one of my colleagues, Janine Sheepers. If you click the little I under her name, then you will be able to direct message her with any technical queries you have. But if there's a problem, just put them in the chat and then Janine will come back with a direct message to you. If the other option for technical queries is to come back out of here and to go to the help desk in the lobby, but hopefully we'll be able to resolve them in the room for you so you don't miss the keynote talk. As I said, all questions should be posted in the chat box. We will be monitoring that and we will post them to Paul at the end of his keynote. And that's really it for the housekeeping. I hope you enjoy the session. And I would now like to pass over to our Chief Executive, Alison Johns, who will welcome us and introduce Paul.
Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our annual Teaching and Learning Conference. And this is quite different, isn't it, from last year? In fact, no, it's very different from last year. I remember us all gathering together, the wonderful conversations, the debate, which is always very good fun. And also, very importantly, the wonderful range of sessions, sharing, insights, experiences that we all bring to this annual conference. Yes, it's very different this year, and I'm delighted to say that we are the first conference to be using our brand new conference platform, which we have secured in order to give as true and full of experience of a conference as we possibly can online. So thank you very much for being the pioneers in using this, and I think we're all having to learn new and different ways. You more than most in terms of how we deliver learning experiences online. So we want to make this as close to a face-to-face event as possible, and we will be starting this morning with some of our live content, and I will introduce Professor Paul Miller in a minute. But today we have two live keynotes, two panel sessions, and our Fast and Furious Ignite session. We also have 130 on-demand sessions for you, and if you can't drop into them today, you can browse them over the next month, because all of the material from today will be up on the web, up on the platform for another 30 days. So I think what's actually great about this is you get the 3 days conference for one day, and then you can pace it and dip into it at your leisure. We do have a networking area, so please take time during the breaks, in the live breaks between the live presentations today, to visit the networking area. There are lots of ways which you can connect up with peers who you haven't seen. There will be themes emerging where you can start discussions with other delegates there. And you can also direct message people who you haven't seen in a while and arrange to meet them there. We also have an exhibition centre, and this is where this year in particular, we have put in there the range of services which Advance HE are offering in terms of membership services, fellowship and teaching awards, charters, endpoint assessment. If you've got any questions about any of those, visit the exhibition where staff will be only too happy to help you. And we're delighted as well that AME, the Association of Medical Education in Europe, are sponsoring us, and so please do pay them a visit to hear what they have to say in terms of the services that they provide. Also, we have the poster hall as usual, and you can view posters from your peers and chat to them live during allocated times in the programme, which is 12:30 and 2:40 p.m. today. Outside of these times, you can leave messages and the poster presenters will respond to those through the chat box and online for you. Celia's already mentioned the help desk, and I was actually quite anxious this morning coming into this platform, and I needed all the help I could get. Please don't hesitate to go to the help desk if you need any support trying to find your way around, or something's not quite working for you. Celia did mention about Janine Schleepers, and she said if you click on the I at the end of her name, it's actually not showing in that right-hand column. So if you go right down to the bottom, you'll find a little slide, and if you move it across, you'll see the I appear. So if you need any help, use the slider at the bottom of that right-hand column on the right-hand side, then you'll see Janine's little I appear. Click on that and she will help you. So just to conclude, I think we've got a hugely interesting day full of really great sessions, speakers, posters, everything that you would hope to get. And also you can, at our usual conference, plus you have the benefit this year of 30 days to look at the bits you might have missed and wish you could have gone to. So have a great conference, and without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Miller. Now, Paul, as you can see here, is Professor of Educational Leadership and Social Justice, and he's also the President of the Commonwealth Council of Education, Administration and Management. He was actually the first Black person to be appointed as a Professor of Educational Leadership in a UK university, and his research is well known, and he has particularly researched into race discrimination amongst overseas trained teachers and teachers of Black or BAME heritage. He's been a teacher himself, so he's really experienced that from the bottom. We're absolutely very fortunate to have all of this experience to be brought into higher education. Paul is widely esteemed for this work, and you will see from the briefing on the database here. But just to let you know some of the things that he has been involved in, he's listed on UNESCO's Etica database. He's an advisor to the Cabinet Office, and they use his work on anti-racist policy development. He's also president of the Commonwealth Council for Administration Management, and a fellow of the Chartered College of Teaching, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and of course a principal of the Higher Education Academy of Advanced HE. So in my book, there's no one better positioned, has better experience really, than to talk to us about inclusive practice with BAME students in higher education. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Paul. Paul is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then Celia will chair a Q&A session with Paul. So please type your questions into the chat box. And without further ado, let's hear from Paul. Welcome, Paul.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Alison. Thank you for that kind introduction, Alison. And thanks to Celia and Advanced HE for the invite to share in this conference this morning, and at such a time as this. I hope everyone out there, you are safe and well wherever you are, and your families as well. We are indeed living and working in very, very interesting times, which I'm sure will be wrapped in some of our papers in the years to come. I want to speak a little bit about BAME students in UK HE and what I'm calling towards a practice of justice, ? And I hope that by the end it will be clear what I am trying to suggest in terms of towards this practice of justice. So the aim of this talk really is to identify the students of BAME Heritage in the UK, or just to give a flavor of who the students are, to look at the experiences of BAME students, to look at potential impact of COVID-19 on BAME students. That data is still coming through, so hence the potential impact, and also to look at potential labor market interaction for students, not only BME, but BME students included from September 2020. And then I want to use a conceptual framework to argue or to suggest a practice of social justice for BME students. So just if we have a look at that slide, we see the numbers of students of BME Heritage in the higher education sector and the number of students as a whole. We also see the number of BME academics, and we see the number of academics as a whole. And what we see is that we have academics, white academics to white students. There is this ratio of 9:1, and for BME students to BME academics, when we drill down on the numbers, we have this ratio of 15:1. And that's just BME students to BME academics and white students to white academics. Now, if we drill down on the numbers a little bit more, we see that we have white students and versus the white academics, 8.6 or 9:1. But then for the category called Black, Asian, and Mixed, as a ratio of the overall numbers of white students, we see that for students in those categories, in that category of white students versus the number of Black academics, Asian academics, mixed academics, it's 53:1. And if we take the larger group of students and staff who are unknown, but in this case the staff, and we add them to that number of 26,000, we get 47,865 versus the numbers of students, and it would be 30:1. So where we are seeing here is that for every 8.6 or 9 white students, there is 1 white academic, but for every Black, Asian, and mixed academic, there are 53 students, white students, and for every Black, Asian, mixed, other, and not known, there are 30 white students. It does says as well that there's a lot to be done in terms of the reporting, because the numbers of unknown is quite high. And if we look at the experience of students of BME Heritage in the system, we see that the sector awarding attainment gap is quite high and still expanding. We have seen suggestions that it's 20, it's 21, but what we know is that it's between 20 and 26, the awarding attainment gap. And although we see 50% more BME students are actually coming into the system, we see, and they are coming in with more or less the same grades or equivalent quality of qualifications on entry, we see that the gap is actually widening. So this is something to think about. We also see at the other end, doctoral students of 20,000 funded PhD fellowships awarded between 2016 and 2018. Only 240 went to BAME students or mixed race students. So what other experiences do BAME students have within the sector, in their institutions? Drawing on research from Hammond et al., we see some experiences of students on particular programs. In this case, it was physiotherapy. Students were suggesting they feel they have no power and no influence. They're not taken seriously. They are not listened to at all. And no matter what they are saying, it's as if they have no capacity to bring about change. And students are also suggesting they feel like, outsiders or the other. Because according to this report, the default student identity in this particular course or this particular program, physiotherapy, is white, middle-class, mature female. And there is also this denial or refusal to tackle racism and microaggression among staff or other white peers, because they deny it, that it exists, or they make light of it. For example, this quote suggests that this person says, well, there was a module that we had to do. It was, what was it called? Clinical preparations. And I had to do like, what are my threats? And I mentioned it. Being someone who is Black, I'm scared that there might be racism. And I had a white female person in a white coat with me. And she was like, well, that doesn't happen. I was like, well, how would you know? How could you possibly know that does not happen? So there was that lack of compassion and almost a denial of their experience or a denial of the position from where they were coming from, this avoidance of this microaggression or this potential threat. There are other experiences of BAME students across the sector, invisibility to hypervisibility. And that is a huge paradox, because some students report this sense of powerlessness, not being seen, not being heard, whereas others report being seen and being heard, perhaps for the wrong reasons, or feeling picked on. And there is evidence that they experience harsh disciplinary sanctions, and in some practice areas, professional courses, teaching, physiotherapy, nursing, and so on, they experience the worst experience on their placements, higher rates of non-completion, and higher rates of failure. And also, in terms of supervision around master's and doctoral programs, there is a suggestion that some of BAME students are sometimes paired with non-specialists staff for their supervision. And then we know there are more BAME students with mental health problems and problems accessing mental health and support services. And this usual thing which we hear all the time, some students appear to operate with, some lecturers appear to operate with deficit models. We hear that all the time. But importantly, lecturers whose modules exhibited no gap, reported that rapport building, repeated reminders of the rules of academic engagement, and communications of high expectations were important to achieving equitable results. So relationships matter, but it's more than relationships as well. It's the communication, it's the high expectations in the first place, and it's the reinforcement of those rules and so on. We see as well that BAME students tend to apply more for extensions for coursework and are less likely to progress to final year. So there are a complexity of issues around the BAME student and the BAME student experience. And then we look at the issue of mental health and the BAME student. This is really, really interesting. So we see research coming out of Birkbeck University saying that fears of prejudice and racism and lack of confidentiality were among key hurdles for groups of BAME students failing to access counseling. That was really, really problematic. So there were cultural stigmas associated with counseling within some groups, and it made it very difficult for them to access these services. But on top of that was the fact that when some of them did go to access the services, there were cultural stigmas, and there were lack of confidentiality, and there was some prejudice or discrimination experience. So the recommendation was that there should be more BAME counselors and support staff in place. And the Mental Health Foundation also did a study which suggested that BAME people are more likely to become disengaged, and in particular in terms of the education sector. They were talking about lack of understanding, and many BAME people didn't engage with the services because of the Mrs. Bibi syndrome, which is patients from South Asian communities, specifically older women, are believed to be undermined and sidelined on the assumption that they are exaggerating their symptoms. So this is really problematic, but there is some cultural lack of awareness or some cultural tensions, and as a result, people who need the services, because they get typecast, they are not using these services. In addition to that, there is some study that looked at BAME students at postgraduate level. And I've tried to color code this because of the complexity of the issues that have been set out. So the stress points are many. Multiple submission deadlines for super competitive funding bids, research proposal, conference abstracts and papers, thesis chapters, managing relationships with sometimes ambivalent supervisors, pressures to publish before supervision, facilitating undergraduate seminars, and seeming never-ending cycle of setting and marking assignments. And you could argue that these experiences and these expectations are the same for any doctoral student. But then it says, and then there is the psychological side, feeling isolated, the imposter syndrome, the loss of motivation, low confidence, uncertainties about the value and validity of their research subject, and future career prospects. And these are really, really important and needs to be looked at, because that imposter syndrome is a very, very common one amongst BAME students and BAME staff in educational and other institutions. And then there are the others. It said these problems are more and more are experienced by postgraduates, but institutional racism, discrimination, hegemonic white privilege make university toxic spaces for Black and minority ethnic students and staff. So this acknowledges that the BAME student experience is one which is fraught. it's one which is complex. And it's not to say some students may not have some of these experiences, but the BME students have a particular experience based on their ethnicity, and that is problematic within the debates. In terms of BME students and COVID-19 and their experiences, there isn't a lot of research at the moment on that. But I know there are lots of proposals. So what I've done is drawn on research from the Education Endowment Foundation, rapid research conducted in May, which looks at the situation in schools. And I would want to suggest that the experience would be very similar. So I want us to extrapolate that the experiences might be very similar for students at HE and FE. So the argument is closures will lead to slower rates of learning or learning loss. But there's also a risk that within that there would be more disadvantage and negative impacts and so on. So there's be a multiplier effect based on COVID-19, an additional problem for learners, but certainly an additional one for those economically disadvantaged and those BME learners. In addition, the kinds of achievement attainment gap, which currently stands within the school sector at modest or immodest levels, depending on how you read the data. It is suggesting that this gap could widen by up to 36%, with differing estimates, good estimates, if you please, in inverted commas, of 11%, but bad estimate of up to 75%. But what we do know is that currently there is a gap of between 20 to 26% at HE, and if this data, if we can extrapolate from it, then we see that there is potential that gap could go as far as 60% in HE. And of course, students will need, scaffolding and support, clear feedback, the stuff we talked about in the DISA report earlier, that the lectures where the gap was minimum or there were no gaps is where you find students were properly scaffolded, clear expectations, and so on. So it was more important to scaffold and to give explanations and support than necessarily when or how, but the methodology, the pedagogy of the teaching was important. So then there was also discussions around how could that look like, catch-up provision, including assessment of lost learning and targeted support, because it can't be one size fits all, and so on. And potentially the need for a kind of a catch-up strategy, and a catch-up strategy that distinguishes between groups, but also even subgroups of students based on their particular needs and their characteristics. But although at the national level there hasn't been any studies, there has been one done at one London university, which I want to share as a case study. So there are 516 participants across the university, approximately 181 BME students, looking at the impact of students of COVID-19 and on students. And almost half of the students had some financial concerns as a result. BME students are 9% more likely than their white peers to suffer additional financial concerns. Mental health was the #1 priority for all students, and this was already a problem within the BME community. 82% of students felt that their study had been affected negatively. And we see students are struggling with home life and with the distractions and mental health and internet access and so on. And we know that already students have family responsibilities, a number of them within the BME community that has been documented as a particular distraction for them under normal circumstances, and then coping with the caring responsibilities, the familial responsibilities, and so on. And then a number of our BME students come from working class backgrounds, and issues around money and survival becomes more important than studying and so on. And there's an opportunity cost there, but there's also an affordability element and the quality of internet access and so on. And then these results are specific to BME students. So BME students were 11% more likely to have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. This is the London University study. 9% are more likely to have additional financial concerns. 8% are more likely to suffer from unstable internet access. 6% are more likely to have additional caring responsibilities. And 12% are more likely to report changes to accommodation. And we've seen a lot of reports recently around gender-based violence, racketeering, going through the roof, and of course within that there are a number of our students of BME and white heritage, and then there is the issue of the intersectionality, where one student here is quoted as saying, "It's more difficult having my family members at home and trying to study. I have young siblings who need to be taken care of sometimes and homeschooled, as both my parents have illnesses and therefore need help quite a lot of times." So the environment makes it a particular challenge, and the distraction that we talked about on the previous slide. Now, in terms of labor market interactions, what could this look like for the BME student or for students in September? Again, there isn't any research on that, but again, drawing on research from the Education Endowment Foundation, looking at schools, and also the Runnymede Trust, looking at the sector as a whole. What we do know is that, as has been suggested here, the pandemic is, exacerbating existing inequalities. So the pandemic is making it worse. And therefore, if the pandemic is making it worse amongst the compulsory sector, then we can extrapolate once more that this would be the same for BME students at HE, given the examples from that London University that I just mentioned. Similarly, the Runnymede Trust suggested, that teachers' expectations of Black students and their working class peers tend to be systematically lower than warranted by their performance in class. So there's a problem which was mentioned earlier about teachers' expectations. But then the Runnymede Trust went on to suggest, ways that universities' admissions teams might need to be looking at developing contextualized admission criteria, so that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds do not get excluded, and those would invariably include a number of BME students. And I suspect Bouguet will be talking this afternoon about some of this in her presentation, looking at access and participation plans. And similarly, the Office for Students, should require, according to the Runnymede Trust, HEIs, all of them, to monitor and report on offers made, on the back of school predictions by ethnicity and gender, so as to check for any bias at the point of admissions. Because the Runnymede Trust is suggesting here that the system is prone to bias, especially when there won't be A levels or any exams to independently judge entry and so on. Which ties into that point above, that teachers' expectations of Black students and their working class peers tend to be systematically lower than warranted by their performance in classes. So it's really important that in the absence of an independent arbiter, then there is a mechanism for checking things like that. So I want to then talk a little bit about what this practice of inclusion could look like for BME students, given what I've just talked about, and given what we know about their experiences, given what we know about the numbers. And I want to suggest a couple of things. So for this conceptual framework, I draw on this model that is in the work of myself and colleagues, where we argue that the work of social justice in education is the work of activism. And we argue that there are three types of activism: pedagogic activism, regulatory activism, and emancipatory activism. In other words, as an educationalist, your work is about activism. And you can't say you are a social justice person and be passive. It's impossible. And so if we go through this analytical frame, in terms of this pedagogic activism, I want to ask, how do we move beyond changes to reading lists to whole curriculum areas or to entire provisions? How do we provide culturally and ethnically relevant and responsive curriculum? How do we move our teaching forward to be inclusive, to draw on the peoples who are sitting in front of us, to draw on their experiences? How do we include them in our classes, in our debates, in our discussion, and their stories and their lives? But how do we make, them feel a part, but more importantly, reflected in the content, in the discourses, in the readings, in everything? And it's not tokenistic, but it's embedded. And I think that is what the work of pedagogic activism is asking us to do. And as a director of teaching and learning, or as a program leader, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is my role? Is my role to be the guardian of teaching and learning policies? Or is my role to be the liberator of diverse and multiple knowledges? And by that, I mean, planning programs that are fit for purpose, in the sense that they reflect the diversity of needs, the diversity of experience, the diversity of peoples who are in our institutions, who are on our programs. The next feature of this model is the regulatory activism. And this is about, how do we use policy creatively? How do we use the law creatively? How do we work within the law or around the law? Not to break the law, but to emancipate. So how can we use existing policies to empower the marginalized amongst us in our institutions, in our classrooms? And do we need to change existing policies if they do harm to members of our community? And because the law does not allow positive discrimination, and we don't want positive discrimination, are there any positive actions that we can take that are within policy, that are within the guidelines, that we can take to, equalize our institutions, to equalize our classrooms, to equalize our practice? And that I think really requires us to look at what the regulations allow and what the regulations are not doing, and look at what institutions are not doing, and look at our policies and whether they too are fit for purpose, or whether they need kind of root and branch surgery. The other part of this is the emancipatory activism. And the emancipatory activism is everything that we couldn't capture in the pedagogic activism and the regulatory activism. How do we use our agency, if not our conscience, to right wrongs or call out racism and injustice? How do we encourage our leaders, our teams, to get EDI as a KPI at our university, at schools, at our school level, at our departmental level, at our program level? How do we create alliances within and beyond our teams and across our institutions to broker, to initiate, to demand institutional change? And how do we hold ourselves and our colleagues and our departments and our schools and our universities accountable? And this means sometimes being unpopular. This means losing friends. This means, sometimes calling out our friends. But it really is asking us, it really is demanding from us that we do not accept the same old in the face of mounting evidence that same old is just not working. And I think we've got a huge opportunity, but I also think we've got a huge responsibility. The final thing I want to talk about is where I begun. Representation. Representation matters. When, as a BME student, you go into your class and you see a BME lecturer, you may never speak to that lecturer. You may never say a word. You may never even have eye contact. But when you see a BME teacher in front of you, and especially one who's at a high level, what the student is saying is, I see you, I hear you, I belong. And if you take nothing else away from this talk today, colleagues, think about that. When a BME student sees a BME lecturer, a BME program leader, a BME head of school, a BME person that they can model, aspire to, be motivated by, they say these three things. I see you, I hear you, I belong. Because you are here, I belong. Because you are here, I believe I can do it. Because you are here, I believe I have an opportunity. I was perhaps coming to get a degree and not sure about my next move, but because I see you, because I hear you, I belong. So the question is, as a director of student experience for the university or similar, what is your role? Is it to promote by default a white student experience, or to promote and deliver a student experience that is culturally and ethnically diverse and relevant, and to be intentional in doing so? And as a vice chancellor or a member of the vice chancellor's group, how do you stop the one in, one out, the shedding of BME staff, the tokenistic recruitment, the vandalism of Black talent? How do you devise and deliver transparent systems for recruitment, retention, and progression of staff, so that when our students see BME lecturers, they can be reassured that they haven't ended up here by mistake, but they belong, they have a right? And we have so many universities with more BME students. We have so many universities with equal number of BME students. And how do we do this? How do we create these transformative spaces? And I think that, colleagues, is my contribution, which I hope is a worthy provocation in terms of BME student in HE towards practice of justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. If you have a chance to glance through the chat, you will see that you have got our delegates screaming yes at their laptops in their houses, and they're with you every step of the way in what you're saying. I think the activism has really inspired everybody from reading this, particularly the pedagogic activism, but people commenting about how they've been fighting the passive approach for years, and how inspirational your talk's been. So thank you very much for that. We are a little tight on time, and we do have our Ignite sessions starting shortly, but I will put a couple of questions to Paul on behalf of everyone. One that got a lot of support from the chat was from a delegate called Jeff, and he was asking whether it's your view that we need BAME terminology at the same time that we're trying to improve inclusivity within higher education. There was a feeling that it's a tag that is thrust upon people and that they're not comfortable with, and wondered what your views were around that.
No, I think that's an interesting question. I do think that there are many different views about the terminology of BAME, and I do think the field itself is moving forward in terms of the terminology. And when a couple of years ago we had BME, then the term evolved to BAME, and then there was the Black and Global Majority, and then in recent times we have ABMO, Asian Black Minority Other. We have AAME, African Asian Minority Other, and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and all of these terms. Now, I do think on one level, if we didn't have racism, we wouldn't need these terms. And I think that is our starting point. But I also think that it's really important for us to sit down and have conversation about these terms and what they mean, because the starting point of trying to solve any problem around racism is that we all need to be talking about the same thing. So whether we call it AAME, BAME, I think the really, really basic thing is to have an honest, open conversation together, so that we understand each other when we talk about these terms, and when we define racism, and when we define institutional racism, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Paul. I think I'll just do two more questions. We wondered if you could comment on, you mentioned the attainment gaps and the numbers of staff and students in schools, given your experience across the education sectors, and wondered if there were any key lessons that higher education could learn from the school sector, in your experience.
Yes. Now, thanks for that. I've just completed a study with some head teachers, and what I've seen them do to try and tackle this problem is work closely with BME staff. They are very decided, very calculated in addressing the gap. The gap with BME staffing. But more importantly, they are seeing the BME staff as active partners in thinking through the problems and also in suggesting solutions. Mm-hmm. So it's not simply you recruit the BME staff and tick that box. It's actually, how do we make their voices heard in our pedagogies, in our behavioral issues, in reaching out to the parents, in brokering those kinds of conversations, those ethnic and cultural issues that might be missed. And I think schools are doing that, some more than others, really well. So I think there is a job to be done in terms of how we use our BME staff within higher education. As I have up on the slide here, there is that shared histories and shared reference point and shared meaning making. And I don't think people have realized that actually we should probably move away from the instrumentality of seeing, the staff as just somebody here to teach philosophy 101, rather than seeing them as a composite resource that can actually work in multiple ways to benefit the organization.
Lovely. And just on the pedagogic activism, one question we had was, should there be specific pedagogic approaches targeted at BAME students, or are you advocating that actually everyone should up their pedagogic game and put the activism in place for all, and then BAME students just benefit from that even more?
I think we don't want to have enclaves within enclaves, but I do think that BME students, given their particular vulnerability within the system, mm-hmm. they do need targeted support. They do need bespoke interventions. But if we are suggesting, which I am advocating, a pedagogy of justice, a practice of justice, then that practice of justice must be equitable. And therefore, we don't want enclaves within enclaves, but what we do want are those interventions as appropriate that takes care of those from the working class, those who from the culturally different environments, those from the racially different environments, according to their needs at those specific times. But I do think that the pedagogy needs to be inclusive.
Thank you, Paul. I'm afraid that is all we have time for this morning. But Paul will be with us again at 3:30 this afternoon for a conversational panel where there will be much more chance for delegates to pose their questions and get into a real conversation with Paul and our other panelists. So do come back and pick up these points. As I think my colleagues have said in the chat as well, we do have the networking area, and I know some of the Advanced HE staff working in this area will be in there after this presentation, and happy to carry on discussions with you there. But for now, I would like to thank Paul very much for a very challenging but a very inspiring talk. It's really good to see the hard, cold statistics, but then have some very inspiring approaches of how we can address this. And I think with the current pandemic and the look that things could actually get worse for our BAME colleagues, we need to act now and get addressing this. So I hope we can pick up some of that this afternoon as well, where we want a very solutions focused discussion. So thank you, Paul. If colleagues wish to attend the Ignite sessions that are now running, you need to leave this room, but head back to the lobby